Hi, this is Dr. Carl Goldkamp. If you're interested in learning about the ketogenic diet like I was, to save my own life, then this is probably the podcast for you. 8 years ago, I knew nothing about it. 6 years ago, it saved my life. 3 years ago, I started researching and talking with some of the authorities in the field and attending medical conferences about this to understand why and how keto so dramatically changed my and my wife's Judy's lives. The purpose of this podcast is to share our journey of discoveries with you and understanding how keto is so effective in improving so many different conditions, from obesity, epilepsy, diabetes, infertility, MS, Alzheimer's, heart disease, to name a few. So take a step away from all the hype you've probably heard and roll up your sleeves with me and join me weekly to explore this living miracle that anyone can access. We'll talk science, we'll talk food. We'll explore its history and evolution to today, which is that the sheer wonder of the ketogenic way of eating has changed untold number of lives, unlike anything before it. And in case I forget to mention it, please join our Facebook group, Keto Naturopath. Welcome back to the next episode of the Keto Naturopath. This is Dr. Carl Goldkamp. I want to finish up on corn and to, again, go back to say why I'm even doing this in the first place, and then finish up on, we'll call it the contamination, which is the use of pesticides and so on. It's just an amazing story. Let's hit the high points from the beginning, why this is an important topic, and then it has to do with keto. It's about the fats. Okay, so one of the most damaging components in our modern diet is processed vegetable oils. They contain excessive amounts of oxygenated omega-6 linoleic acid, which is a PUFA, which is a polyunsaturated fatty acid. The biological damage they cause is even worse than that caused by refined sugar and high-fructose corn syrup. Interesting, high-fructose corn syrup comes from corn. Virtually all chronic metabolic and degenerative diseases, including age-related macular degeneration, are primarily caused by the preponderance of industrial vegetable oils in your diet. Interesting. Vegetable oils degrade to extremely toxic oxidation products when heated, including cyclic aldehydes, which contribute to the development of heart disease and neurodegenerative diseases. Two common sources of harmful polyunsaturated fatty acids are conventionally farmed chicken and pork. Chicken and pork. And as much as I'm focusing on cattle, I do this because it was easier to follow one animal. But the same thing exists for chicken. The same thing exists for pork. Pork never ate corn. Chicken never ate this corn. It didn't eat much corn at all. They mostly ate bugs and so on and so forth. So that whole change was for pork and chicken as well. So we're talking about the omega-6 fats that came from the oils through these animals that will get to you. The bottom line is replacing vegetable oils and that foods that contain them. This is hard, but it's just the truthful bottom line. With healthy fats can go a long way towards boosting your health and reducing your risk and basically increasing your metabolic health. It's a factor. It's a big factor. It's, now the story is really since the 60s and late 50s. It's interesting when you overlay this story, which I've been going on about, with the whole idea of saturated fats that started under Ansel Keys, that also started in the late 50s and early 60s, that all saturated fats were bad. There was a bad turn taken in the late 50s for sure, that only now is getting corrected. Okay, so that's the big picture of, why are we doing this? And when we put it in the context of people thinking about keto, one is fats is a big part of knowing your fats and the kind of fats that you need. And having enough fats, you don't have to go high fat. It's not low carb and high fat, in my view, anymore. Is to choose your fats wisely and have good fats. So now we're going to go, and I'm going to depress you even more, but I find it's a fascinating story, and I wouldn't have dug into this had I not seen a line in something I read a couple months ago that was about the omega-6 fatty acids in beef, corn, pork, and that aspect as opposed to just corn oil. So, corn oil is part of it, but it's mostly in the foods you're getting. So now, how contaminated, how much pesticides and what kind of pesticides are used on corn? I'm going to do some of this reading. I'd put together sort of a little post for our Facebook group, so I'm going to read from that. Keeps me on track. So corn today is mainly used for biofuels. About 40% of U.S. corn is used for ethanol and is animal feed. Roughly 36% of the corn plus distillers' grain left over from the ethanol production is fed to cattle, pigs, and chicken. How's that? And even some of that is exported. Corn is the largest source of pesticides. That is, it dominates pesticide usage, with about 40% of all pesticides used in the U.S. is used on corn. After that, it's soy for 22%. And these are the largest shares. Total volume is used on these two crops. Isn't it amazing? So that's 40 plus 22. That's 62. Well over half is used on just two crops. Then you get into genetic engineering and pesticide resistance. I mentioned that a little bit before, that they did the GE, genetically engineered seeds. The idea is make them tolerant of the pesticides that you're going to use, and therefore you'll have a win-win. I'm just speaking the logic, not really a win-win. That logic really hasn't panned out. It did maybe the first round, and after that, what they do is the pesticides generate resistance, just like antibiotic resistance starts. There's a few bugs out there, bacteria out there that are strong enough to resist it. They have more, and then that population increases. So the GE, that is genetically engineered seeds way of thinking to add to the pesticides, it really goes together with it. Started in the 90s. Bad news first. Only 3 types of pesticides used on corn. Atrazine, glyphosate in 2 different forms, and acetochlor. The debate that is still up in the air, that is, there's no black or white, there's not a lot of studies done on one side or the other, is what is the nutritional difference between, I'll call it range-fed cattle and range-fed, pasture-fed dairy cows. And there actually are farms that are going back to pasture-raising dairy cows. And there is a difference, but there's not a lot. The problem is you have these farms that are few and are growing, hopefully, but there's not a lot of testing between A or B. And the reason there's not a lot of testing is because nobody wants the bad news to get out. There's a big difference. However, there are some differences. And so they found really the 2 things, and this is the point that I wanted to bring up, is that you do have a slight dropping of omega-3s that you would have found in pasture-raised meat versus non-pasture-raised meat. I've talked to an agronomist who's one who studies animal grazing and so on and so forth. He said, I think the case is overblown. There's not that much of a difference. So be it. I don't know. I have to depend on other people. But clearly, you can't compare a meat dinner versus a salmon dinner. I mean, there's a whole difference in terms of the content of fish having as a source of omega-3s. And we knew that it's been said a number of times on this podcast, but you go back to Stephen Kinane's book, Survival of the Fattest, we go that our whole population, man, evolved along the ocean sides and then the river sides, basically a fish-based population growth until it became other things. There's still research in is there a difference or not, but I don't think that's ever going to be known. I don't think that's ever going to be studied because what farm would let you in to say that you're going to tell everybody that my meats or milk is not as good as the other? So it's kind of a no-go. The industry, the cattle industry and the dairy industry, and their lobbies, I should say, are very strong. They're not small in any way. So that's the way that goes. In terms of the development of corn, as you can guess, they try to develop it so, pesticides was the next thing in addition to fertilizers. And then genetically modified corn was with the speculation, everything is, Monsanto's a big mover there, and Syngenta is another big mover there, that they developed these genetically modified corn with the idea being that they'll require fewer or less pesticides collectively. And though initially, so we hear about Roundup, which is glyphosate. The glyphosate has been banned in Germany and a number of other countries. We're going to get into other pesticides in a second. But they would develop a genetically modified corn to be able to tolerate glyphosate, so therefore the weeds would be the ones who would be killed and not the corn. The logic is there, but after a number of generations, what you find is that certain weeds become tolerant to glyphosate. And it tends to backfire, and you need to go on to not only the next genetically modified corn, but the next pesticide. So that's how that cycle goes. The other thing I want to mention is that we talked about before is the omega-6 that comes from corn. It's now in cattle that they wouldn't have had as much of. That's one of the reasons they're pretty pro-inflammatory. So then they require a lot of antibiotics. And then this is the source of the antibiotic resistance, one of the sources. I'm giving you sort of the global paraphrased. Perhaps it's not completely oversimplified. It's just the bigger points. So I don't get stuck in the weeds here. This is what's sort of evolving, is this massive corn empire that needs to find markets. The animals were one, the corn oil was another, and wherever they can sell their corn, they will. It's kind of fascinating if you look at it in that regard, but it also has unintended consequences. I know this seems like a lot of information and I'm just down on corn. It's just, it has become such a fascinating and kind of revolting story of American progress relative to, you have to say, the politics. These big agribusinesses, as well as pharma, have affected the politics in determining what are the dietary guidelines. And they've just perpetuated a lot of nonsense since the 50s, which I've already talked about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens with the cows, and I'm going to get back to the pesticides. So hopefully I'm just regaling you on all the nauseating things you wish you never knew about, but are important. And guess what? These are issues that, if you're my age, I can say my parents never had to deal with, but more than likely you're probably half my age, so it's really your grandparents never had to deal with these issues. And I think some of this you'll find history reveals a lot. And if you see how we got to the present, then you can understand with greater commitment why it's worth your effort to avoid certain things. And the whole story of corn kind of represents a lot of these components in our dietary repertoire, I should say. So let's get to the cows, and then we'll get back to the pesticides. So perhaps the most serious thing that can go wrong with a cow, a ruminant, on corn is what they call feedlot bloat. They really bloat up. And here's why. The rumen is always producing, that is the stomach, is always producing copious amounts of gas, which normally get expelled by belching while they're digesting during rumination. But when the diet contains too much starch, i.e. corn, and too little roughage, rumination all but stops, and a layer of, brace yourself, foamy slime that can trap gas forms in the stomach, in the rumen. The rumen inflates like a balloon, pressing against the animal's lungs, and unless action is promptly taken, usually that means a big hose put down the throat of the cow will suffocate. That's how important it is. So corn diet can also give a cow acidosis. Unlike our own highly acidic stomachs, the normal pH of a cow's stomach, its rumen, using that word a lot, I know, is neutral. So the cow's stomach is neutral. Human stomachs are very acidic, down to a pH of 2, arguably 1.5, which is very acidic. That's the kind of acidity that can dissolve metal, by the way, which is kind of a miracle of how our tracks have developed. Anyway, corn makes it unnaturally acidic, right? From neutral to unnaturally acidic. However, causing a kind of bovine heartburn, which in some cases can kill the animal, but usually makes it sick. Acidotic animals, those with these hyperacid stomachs, go off their feed. They pant and they salivate and they excessively paw at their bellies and eat dirt. The condition leads to a diarrhea, ulcers, bloat, liver disease, and a general weakening of the immune system that leaves the animal vulnerable to everything from pneumonia to feedlot polio. Okay, so now, how do you think they would treat this now vulnerable immune system of cows? Clock's ticking, and you probably know that. Enter the huge amount of antibiotics that are given to cattle. And so some antibiotics can be justified, but what the corn has induced is a very poor immune system. So in other words, they get sick a lot, they get antibiotics a lot, which, by the way, the benefit to the farmer, this kind of farm, this kind of agri-farm, is that the animals get fatter. So a bigger animal is more financially rewarding than a thinner animal. So feedlot beef, as it's called today, would be impossible if it weren't for routine and continual feeding of antibiotics to these animals. This leads directly to what is inexorably to the development of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. These new superbugs are increasingly rendering our antibiotics ineffective for treating disease in humans. This is absolutely true. I'm just reading my notes, by the way, in case you think I can contain all this in my head. I cannot. But this is one of the biggest sources, and about 80% of all antibiotics in the United States go to cattle, go to animals in general, but large animal, not your kitty or your dog, but to large animals, to farms. And one reason the method was used a lot is because the animals fattened up. As for no other reasons, to make them fatter and heavier was an efficient use, quote unquote, efficient use of one's resources to get more money back from selling the cows and the beef and so on, or producing milk or whatever it is. So it goes on, and you can really trace it down to, let me say a little further here. Further, it is the commercial meat industry's practice of keeping cattle in feedlots and feeding them grain that is responsible for the heightened prevalence of specifically E. coli 0157. So they really got it down to what they can identify as a result of this. And I'm sure we can be specific in other aspects as well. So the point is that I'm trying to get across is that when you don't feed cattle what they're supposed to eat, which is grass, not grain, that they're going to have some problems. And so we enumerated that it certainly gives them the bloat factor, which then leads to either death and then other things that need to be treated with medications, namely antibiotics for the most part. And then that leads to antibiotic resistance. Kind of like pesticides, by the way, right? So you use pesticides a lot and bugs develop a resistance, and consequently that pesticide becomes less effective and you got to move on to something else, ideally something else you can find. But when you start running out of things that you can find, it becomes a problem. So that's where we are today. So am I trying to make you paranoid about eating beef that's grain-fed? Partly. When we can, we're moving into a house that we just got, which is nice. We have a little more control over the space and so on and so forth. And we've lived in our own houses before. At that point, we did have a big freezer, a couple of freezers, and then you can go out to the farm and you can buy your half a cow and your chicken and your pigs and so on and so forth. And you can really grade up your quality of meat. But for most people, they don't have this choice. I totally understand. But they could if they wanted to, by the way. They could if they wanted to. We're not making these choices because we're hyper affluent. No, that's not the case. We're making these choices because it's a better choice to make. Now, having been through our health crisis, see the beginning of this podcast series of a couple of years ago, that is a high priority in our life to take care of our health. Let me segue for a second. I know it's a little bit kind of like extemporaneous, a bit of a distraction, but I was at a conference and it's really interesting. And there's a number of heavy people around and it's interesting to see what they eat. When I just come back and they had a hard time, was struggling to come back from their particular COVID experience. It was interesting to see that person use, having potato chips and drinking Coca-Cola and so on and so forth. So the connection between what you eat and that you were sick and that maybe you can get less sick if you eat better food and really be where, it's not there. And the person leading the conference, so multimillionaire, and yet they don't see this. What they see is that I'm heavy. If it really gets to be a issue, I will then address it. Address it at 50 pounds excess, 100 pounds excess, 150 pounds excess, and that I'm still that skinny guy or woman inside and it's all going to come back and I'm going to be good. So this is the American public, and I'm sorry if I'm overgeneralizing, but it's more true than not by a lot. And that is that we tend to feel that our health is more expendable. In other words, we can get to it later. And consequently, we get to very poor health conditions now that drive very serious issues that can't be pulled back. I mean, there is some permanent damage that is caused, call it cardiovascular. So that would be a mitochondrial health issue, which is kind of the core of what we're talking about here in the Keto Naturopath. And we tend not to think about it. It's not because we're not that aware of it. It's because, each day has its own emergencies, let's say, and you deal with the emergencies. If you don't have a health emergency, you're not going to be dealing with that. You're going to have that little Twizzlers to give you the energy, the Coca-Cola to give you the energy, the whatever to get behind you so you're, quote unquote, you feel more efficient at what you're doing, whatever that work is. And you get yourself in trouble that way. Whereas the thinking I'm trying to turn around, I'm trying to turn that wheel around here in my podcast is that no, The health really comes first, and that will lead to efficiency of thought and efficiency of thinking. You'll be more aware of a good night's sleep. You'll be more aware of when you need to take a break. You'll be more aware of critical thinking. You'll be doing your own critical thinking, and instead of just following and looking for this little crib sheet of biohacks you can do to bring yourself back to clear thinking, if that's your goal. You follow my thinking. Follow my logic, I should say. So that was a sample of what happens to the cows, and we eat those cows. And then the question is, so what happens to us? At this point, it's really just rhetorical. It's really too much to track down by saying, here's the muscle mass of a man or woman in their 40s or 50s or 60s that ate corn cow, we'll call them, right? Don't we wish that was available, but it's not. But what we can trace, now we're coming back to the pesticides, is what we can trace is the pesticides that has been used on the corn in higher and higher and higher amounts. As I mentioned, it's nearly 40% of all pesticides in the United States are used on corn, 22% on soy. Add those together, which are both used to feed cows, 62%. 62% of pesticides in the United States is what you're consuming indirectly. Do we think that might be a problem? Okay, so the pesticides we're going to talk about, really begs this, how contaminated is our corn, which is the corn the cattle eat. It's the corn oil that you use to cook with. It's the high-fructose corn syrup. So all those derivative products that come from corn have their share of contamination. Don't think that they come out clean, or they can just be scraped off like you're cleaning off the scraps at the end of a meal and throwing it into the garbage. No, it's not that easy. It is inherent. It's bound to receptors, and you're eating all that. Okay, let's get to that part. Okay, I'll keep this list short, and I'll try to get a little depth here. So the pesticides we're talking about are atrazine, glyphosate, and acetochlor. Acetochlor is probably the oldest of that, and I'll even give you the percentages. Of all the pesticides that are used on corn, 60% of that list of pesticides, of those three, 60% is atrazine, 33% is glyphosate, which is also Roundup, and then the third is acetochlor. And all three of these have been banned in a number of countries, and I've mentioned before, even Saudi Arabia has banned glyphosate, atrazine, and acetochlor. All of the EU is not uniformly in one lockstep. Germany has banned more of these than others. But atrazine has been around well before I got into medicine, so over 20 years, and it's always been on the list of, do you know what it can do? So here's what. By coincidence, this week I'm on the email for the Environmental Working Group, and they're always saying, hey, put your name to a petition about this dangerous pesticide and that dangerous pesticide, and I'm more than happy to do it most of the time. Not that we have an EPA that has any power nowadays. That went out a couple administrations ago, but this is about the atrazine. So it goes, this petition is about telling the EPA that they should focus on this, which is something they should have been focused on 20 years ago. So let's just listen to this. Would you drink a glass of water if it contained a chemical that was able to turn male frogs into female frogs? Right now, millions of Americans are at risk of drinking atrazine, toxic pesticide that has been linked to serious health risks like cancer, shorter pregnancies, and hormone disruption. Leave it at that. By the way, I'm going to segue now to say the biggest areas geographically that are using these pesticides are Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota. Those are by far the biggest pesticide, what do you call them, empires, whatever. But it's the Midwest, as our breadbasket, so to say. But those are the states. And so if you're living in these states, and most of the pesticides are applied aerially by plane, is that the contamination is pretty vast. And so you think about people from the central of the United States are the ones most at risk for taking these things taking up these contaminants in their drinking water. And so atrazine is such a powerful hormone disruptor, it can even turn male frogs into female frogs. According to the EPA's own assessment, atrazine is likely to adversely affect roughly 1,000 threatened or endangered species. And it goes on and on, which you can sort of guess is an extension of what we're saying right now. So I'll leave it at that. But you look under atrazine, and this is not a big secret, by the way. Just go to Google, go atrazine. You don't even have to say harmful effects of, or countries that have banned. And you'll be surprised how many countries have banned atrazine. As I say, this is not a new pesticide. This has been out there a long time. Let's go under glyphosate. I think I'll keep it short on glyphosate and say it's used mostly for two reasons. One is a desiccant. It's put on crops. So if you can imagine whether it's corn or wheat or any particular grain, soy as well, that, you really want to harvest the grains when it's dry out and been dry for about a week. And so when it comes time to, you want rain for these things to grow, but then when they're reaching their peak, you don't want it to rain. You want it to be nice and dry so you can get out there and harvest it. So often that's not quite the case, and that's somewhat damp. And so what they put on is a desiccant, something to dry out the grains that have just been harvested. And so that's one use, and a very common use, for glyphosate. And the other is that glyphosate, otherwise known as Roundup, is part of a genetically modified potato and now other crops. And what they do is they work on developing a gene that can tolerate glyphosate. So they now work in the lab and make a gene, incorporate it into the corn and everything else. And so they can really smother the landscape with glyphosate. So everything else dies, but the corn, or the thing that you now have as a GMO, a genetically modified organism, or GE, genetically engineered, I should probably say, survives. Well, and all the other bugs don't bother it. That worked for a while, apart from the toxicity of glyphosate, but bugs have adapted. And so now the bugs are coming back and they're looking for something else. And they're actually going back to the older pesticides to go in addition to glyphosate, to now just have this combination of 2 or 3 or 4. So you can go on and on and on with the different pesticides. And that's where the acetochlor comes in as well. So I'm going to leave it at that, but also to say that they found weed killer in granola and crackers. And the FDA is quite aware of this. I'm not trying to make a bad guy here, but it is. That's the reality that I see. And so what would you do knowing that reality? I would just pick a little more carefully. And ideally, we would have products, however processed they are, with fewer, ideally none or no, pesticides that have been used on the various crops. Potentially, they say it's more expensive, but the idea of using pesticides on crops to make them quote unquote cheaper and less bug-eaten has become more and more expensive. And so the jury's out, other than there's a lot of politics involved, as you can well imagine. So that's pretty much the end of, if you're thinking of corn oil, high-fructose corn syrup, which is obviously in the Coca-Cola and so on and so forth, it just permeates our society. I'm not saying, hey, I just made you think it's all terrible. I'm hopefully making you choose more wisely to products that don't contain these things. And if they start losing market share, then they'll change their decisions. That's how I think it should work. And that's the side of the equation that I'm hoping does work. So until next time, try to think about corn. Bye-bye. Hi, this is Dr. Goldkamp. I just wanted to encourage you to send in your questions to drgoldkamp@ketonaturopath.com. Many of you have, and so what I've done with these questions, that I've gotten back to most of the people I email, but some of the questions that were so good, and if they were overlapping to other questions, I would combine them and try to put that into the topic of a podcast, either via one of the micro topics that are covered in an interview. As you know, we cover a lot of topics in a given interview, or some of my own sort of reporting, if you will, on some of these issues. So please keep the questions coming. Feel free to send in an email, and I will get back to you. Stay listening, send in your questions, and I will definitely get back to you.